Good afternoon, mental data and my fellow friends. I'm Leong.
I'm Calvin Wong.
I'm Elvis.
Before we begin, I would like to share something that happened to me recently. While I was cleaning my room, I found a notebook that I bought at the beginning of this semester. What surprised me was that it was still brand new. I had not used a single page. Then I remember buying another notebook just a few weeks later because I thought I didn't have one. Looking back, I realized I didn't actually need another notebook. I had simply forgotten what I already owned. It reminded me of Herbert Simon's idea of bounded rationality. He suggests that people don't always make perfectly rational decisions because our attention and memory are naturally limited. Has anything like this ever happened to either of you?
Yes, definitely. Mine wasn't a notebook. It was a water bottle. I already had one that worked perfectly well. But I bought another one simply because I liked the design. Only after I got home did I realized there was nothing wrong with the old one. When I reflect on it, I realized I wasn't buying it because I need it. I bought it because it matched how I want to express myself. That remind me of Black extended self-theory, which explains that people sometimes buy things because they represent part of the identity, not just because they have a practical purpose.
I had a similar experience. Mine was a pair of wireless earbuds. The old pair was still working, but an online advertisement kept promoting a 50% discount off limited time offer. I feel like I would miss a great opportunity if I didn't buy it immediately. Looking back, I realized I wasn't making a logical decision. I was reacting to the way the offer was represented.
It is interesting that although we bought completely different things, the pattern behind our decisions was surprisingly similar. None of us really needed those items. Instead, our choices seem to be influenced by memory, emotions, or the way the situation was presented. So let me ask both of you something. Do you think these were really our own decisions, or were we influenced more than we realized?
Personally, I think emotion often comes first. When I bought the bottle, I never asked myself, do I really need this? I simply thought I like it. Only afterwards did I start giving myself reason to justify the purchase.
I agree with you, Elvis. Sometimes we believe we are making careful decisions, but many everyday choices are shaped by habits, advertising, and convenience before we even notice it. So perhaps the real issue isn't whether we make the decision, but what influenced those decisions in the first place.
I think both of you have raised an important point. Maybe the products themselves aren't the real issue. What is more important is understanding why we make these choices and what shapes them. Let us explore that from different perspectives.
That really makes me think about something else. If we usually realize these things only after we have made the purchase, then perhaps the real issue isn't whether we are good or bad consumers. Maybe it's whether we are actually aware of what's influenced us while we are making the decisions. For example, I don't think anyone wakes up and says, today I'm going to waste my money. Most people genuinely believe they are making a sensible choice at the moment. It's only later, when the excitement fades, that we begin to question whether it was necessary. So I'm wondering, are we making conscious decisions, or are we simply reacting to our surroundings without noticing?
That is an interesting question, Elvis. If that is true, then awareness becomes much more complicated than I first thought. Initially, I assumed that being a responsible consumer simply means knowing what is right and what is wrong. But after listening to both of you, I'm beginning to think knowledge alone is not enough. Let me ask both of you another question. If I know that buying something is unnecessary, why do I sometimes still end up buying it anyway? What happens between knowing and doing? Because there seems to be a gap there. What do you think?
I think that is exactly where psychology becomes important. One way to understand it is by looking at consumption as a sequence rather than a single decision.
So, what you are saying is that many of our purchasing decisions are actually habits instead of carefully planned choice? If that's true, it makes me wonder how much freedom we really have, because habits can be incredibly powerful. Sometimes I open on an online shopping apps without intending to buy anything. I tell myself I'm just browsing, then 20 minutes later I have already added several items to my cart. Nothing forced me to do it, yet somehow it happened almost automatically.
Exactly, and that is why I wouldn't say people are irrational. I didn't say our thinking often operates on autopilot. Once a behavior becomes familiar, our brain tries to save effort by repeating what it has done before. Recent study on digital consumer behavior has found something similar. Research has shown that personalized recommendation and repeated exposure can gradually normalize purchasing behavior, making products feel increasingly familiar and desirable even before consumers actively search for them. That doesn't remove our freedom to choose, but it does mean our choices are constantly being influenced in subtle ways.
I really like the word subtle because I think that is what makes this issue difficult to recognize. If someone forced us to buy something, we would immediately notice. But when the influence is small, seeing the same product every day, receiving another notification, watching another short video, we hardly realize it is happening. Can I ask both of you something again? Do you think companies intentionally design these experiences to encourage us to consume more? Or are they simply responding to what consumers already want?
Personally, I think it's probably both. Companies obviously want people to buy their products because that's how business survive. At the same time, consumers also expect convenience. The problem is that convenience sometimes removes the opportunity to pause and reflect. For example, years ago, if we want to buy something, we have to travel to a shop. Now, we only need a few taps on our phone. Because buying has become so easy, thinking carefully before buying has almost become optional.
I agree, and I think digital technology has changed not only how we shop, but also how we think. There is a recent discussion in consumer behavior research suggesting that the digital platform don't simply provide information anymore. They also predict what users are likely to want based on previous behavior. In the other words, the platform gradually learns our preference and then present products that increasingly difficult for us to ignore. There is why two people opening the same shopping app may actually see the completely different recommendation. The system is already addicting to each individual.
That makes me think about something we experience every day. Although we know there are different explanations for why that happens, but regardless of the reason, it creates the feeling that products are following us everywhere.
Yeah.
When that happens repeatedly, resisting temptation becomes much more difficult.
Yes, I have experienced that before. And when something feels normal, buying it doesn't seem like a big decision anymore.
Actually, what Elvis just mentioned connect quite closely with the idea of behavioral farming. Researchers have long suggested that the people don't only respond to the product itself, they also respond to the content surrounding it. For example, if a product is labeled as bestseller or almost sold out, many consumers immediately assume that it must be valuable, even without comparing it objectively. So sometimes we are not evaluating the product, we are evaluating the message around the product.
That is a really important distinction. So perhaps the real challenge is not simply teaching people to spend less. Maybe it is helping people become more aware of how decisions are being shaped before the purchase even happens. Because once we understand those influences, we are probably in a much better position to make thoughtful choices. But I would like to challenge both of you a little. If environment plays such a powerful role, does that mean individual responsibility becomes less important? Or do individuals still carry the same responsibility regardless of the influence around them? I am curious to hear both of your perspectives before we move on.
That's actually a difficult question. Personally, I don't think individual responsibility becomes less important, but I do think our surrounding influence us more than we realize. For example, when sustainable products are affordable and easy to access, people are naturally more willing to choose them. So perhaps people don't always make poor decisions because they don't care. They often respond to the choice available around them.
I like that perspective, Elvis. So responsibility doesn't disappear, but it exists within a particular environment. Instead of asking whether individuals or systems are more important, perhaps we should ask how they influence one another. Kelvin, what do you think?
I agree, because in fact, I think the knowledge isn't always the biggest issue. Most people already know that the recycling and reducing waste are the good practice. Yet, many still struggle to apply them consistently. That tells us that the information alone isn't enough. A recent UNESCO report on education for sustainable development also highlights that the sustainable behavior developed through knowledge, values, critical thinking, and also repeated practice, not knowledge alone.
That reminds me of my teaching practicum. Whenever I ask students when they should reduce waste, almost everyone gave the correct answer. But after recess, wrappers were still left on the tables. That made me realize something. Knowing the right answer doesn't automatically create the right habits.
There's a really important distinction. Maybe we can think of it as three cognitive stages: understanding, reflection, and behavior. Learning begins with knowledge, but lasting change only happens when people reflect on their own actions and gradually build better habits. Would both of you agree?
Definitely, reflection is often the turning point. For example, hearing about the fast fashion is one thing, but opening your wardrobe and finding clothes you have never worn create a completely different impact. That's when knowledge becomes personal.
I experienced that myself. While packaging for campus, I found clothes that still had their price tag attached. It makes me realize my own behavior did not match my values. Sometimes those personal discoveries are much more powerful than being told what is right.
I think that is a valuable lesson for us as future teachers. Perhaps our role isn't simply to provide answers, but to create learning experiences that encourage students to question their own behavior. Instead of asking, what is responsible consumption, we could ask, what is one habit you would like to improve? I think that encourages much deeper reflection.
I agree. That is also why experiential learning is so effective. Students remember what they experience much more clearly than what they only hear in the class.
Can I ask both of you something? If consumers become more responsible, will producers naturally become more responsible too? Or do business have an independent responsibility regardless of consumer behavior?
That is a challenging question. At first, I wanted to say yes, because businesses usually respond to demand. But now I'm not so sure. Kelvin?
I think the relationship works both ways. Consumer influence business through the purchasing choice, while businesses influence customers through the marketing. Product design and pricing. That's why many recent sustainability discuss describe responsible consumption as a shared responsibility rather than an individual one.
I like that conclusion because it feels balanced instead of asking who should change first. Perhaps the better question is how can everyone contribute together?
Exactly. When we first started this discussion, we were only talking about a notebook, a water bottle, and a pair of earbuds. Now we have connected those simple experiences to consumers, businesses, education, and society. I think that reminds us that responsible consumption is not just about buying fewer things. It is about understanding the wider system behind every choice. And with that understanding, let's move on to what we, as future educators, can actually do to encourage long-term change. I think our discussion has gradually moved from personal habits to larger systems, but I would like us to focus on another perspective that is especially relevant to us. As future teachers, we won't just be responsible for managing a classroom. We will also have opportunities to influence how young people think and make decisions. So let me ask both of you this. If you were teaching primary school students, how would you help them understand responsible consumption in a way that actually changes their behavior rather than simply helping them memorize facts?
I don't think I will begin with definitions or statistics. Young children usually connect more easily with experience than explanations. For example, instead of telling them that wasting food is harmful, I might ask them to record how much food is left on their plates every day for a week. At the end of the week, we should discuss the results together. I think seeing their own behavior will leave a stronger impression than simply listening to lessons. Educational research continues to support this idea. Recent studies on the experiential learning show that students develop deeper understanding when they actively experience, reflect on, and discuss real situations instead of only receiving information.
I really like that because it allows students to discover the problem themselves instead of being told what the problem is. When learners recognize their own habits, the lesson becomes much more personal. Kelvin, would you approach it in the same way or would you add something different?
I agree with Elvis, but I think experience alone isn't enough. Students also need the opportunity to analyze why those behavior happen. For example, after reporting food waste, I would encourage the student to discuss the question about like, why did we have more food than we could finish? Or were we really hungry? Or were we simply afraid there wouldn't be enough later? Those conversations help the student to connect the behavior with underlying reason. Current UNESCO recommendation on education for sustainable development also emphasizes that the learners should develop critical thinking and decision-making skill, not just environmental knowledge.
That's true. Without reflection, students might collect data but never really learn from it. Reflection is what helps them connect the activity to their own life. I also think group discussions are important because students often learn from listening to one another's experience. Sometimes hearing a classmate explain a mistake feels more relatable than hearing the same advice from a teacher.
That is an interesting point. So perhaps we can think of learning as a sequence. First, students experience something, then they reflect on it. After that, they discuss it with others before deciding how they might improve. That seems much more meaningful than simply asking students to memorize. To memorize the definition of sustainable consumption. How could teachers help to maintain the culture of sustainability? Do you have any idea about this, Kelvin?
In my opinion, one possibility is integrating the small sustainability routine into daily classroom life. For example, assigning weekly classroom monitor to check energy use, encouraging students to reuse learning material whenever appropriate, or asking group to reflect briefly on how they reduce waste during a project. None of these project. None of these activity are complicated, but repeated over time, they help build habits instead of simply increasing the awareness. Recent educational research also suggests that students are more likely to sustain environmentally responsible behavior when sustainable practice become part of their regular learning environment rather than the isolated activities.
I agree. Those routines also help students understand that sustainability isn't something we practice only during special events. It becomes part of ordinary decision making. For example, instead of immediately buying new materials for every project, students could first discuss whenever existing material could be reused or adapted. That simple conversation encourages creativity as well as responsible consumption.
I really like that idea because it changes the question students ask themselves. Instead of automatically thinking, what do I need to buy? They begin asking, what do I already have and how can I use it differently? I think that is exactly the kind of mindset we hope to develop as future educators.
Can I ask both of you something before we move on? After discussing all these classroom ideas, do you think school alone can create responsible consumer, or does the lasting change require support from families and the wider community as well?
Personally, I think school can start the process, but they can't complete it alone. If students learn one set of values in school but experience completely different habits at home or in the society, maintaining those behaviors becomes much more difficult. That's why families, communities, and even business all have important roles to play.
I think we have reached another interesting conclusion. Education may begin in classrooms, but responsible consumption develops through consistent experiences across different environments. Throughout our discussion, we have explored this issue from several different perspectives. We have talked about individuals, businesses, schools, governments, and even our future roles as educators. The more we discuss it, the more I realize that everyone seems to have a part to play. Perhaps instead of asking who is responsible, we should ask how can each stakeholder contribute according to their role. I think that question encourages collaboration rather than conflict.
Exactly. For example, businesses can reduce unnecessary packaging and improve product durability. Governments can introduce supportive policies and invest in sustainable infrastructure. School can educate future generations through meaningful learning experience. Consumer, on the other hand, can make more mindful purchasing decisions and reduce unnecessary waste. When each stakeholder contributes within their own capacity, the overall impact becomes much greater.
Can I add one more though? Sometimes people feel discouraged because they think their individual's actions are too small to matter. But I don't think sustainability has ever depend on one person's actions. It depends on many people making consistent choice over time. That's why I believe every responsible action has value, even if we don't immediately see its impact.
I really appreciate this perspective. It also reminds us that meaningful change doesn't usually happen overnight. Most positive changes develop gradually through repeated actions, continuous learning, and cooperation. As future educators, perhaps one of our responsibilities is helping students understand the sustainability is not about achieving perfection. It is about making better decisions more consistently.
I totally agree with you. Sometimes people avoid participating because they feel they can't do everything perfectly. But responsible consumption isn't about perfection, it's about improvement.
Yes, I think we can confidently say that we have reached a shared understanding. Responsible consumption and production cannot be achieved by expecting only one group to change. Instead, it depends on cooperation between individuals, educational institutions, businesses, governments, and communities. When each stakeholder recognizes both their influence and their responsibility, sustainable behavior becomes much more achievable. Before we conclude our discussion, I would like us to return to where we first began. At the beginning, we were simply talking about a notebook, a water bottle, and a pair of wireless earbuds. Those seem like very ordinary purchases. But after everything we have discussed today, I wonder whether we see those situations differently now. How has this conversation changed the way each of us thinks?
Honestly, this discussion has changed the way I look at everyday consumption. At first, I thought responsible consumption was mainly about choosing environmental friendly products. But now I realize that it began much earlier, with the decisions of whether we actually need to buy something at all. Every purchase involves resource, energy, and human efforts, so even small decisions deserve more thought. For me, the biggest lesson is that sustainability isn't about being perfect, it's about becoming more mindful in our daily choice.
I agree with you. Throughout our discussion, we will move from talking about individual purchasing to understanding how consumer, producer, governments, school, and communities are all connected.
I think we have reached a meaningful consensus today. Responsible consumption and production is not about asking people to stop consuming. It is about making wiser and more intentional choices. As future educators, our responsibility goes beyond teaching facts about sustainability. We should help students develop critical thinking, reflective habits, and awareness of how their everyday decisions affect the wider community and environment. If education can encourage that mindset, then every thoughtful choice, no matter how small, becomes part of building a more sustainable future. Thank you very much for listening.